The scent of time was the only perfume Elara Vance ever wore. It clung to her skin and settled in her hair, a delicate, dry fragrance of aging paper, brittle leather, and the faint, sweet aroma of decay. At 22, her world was confined to the four walls of a dusty workshop in Boston's historic district, a sanctuary where she performed miracles on the forgotten and the broken. Her hands, slender and pale, moved with a surgeon's precision, mending a torn vellum page or reinforcing the spine of a 17th-century manuscript. She poured her soul into these inanimate objects, giving them a future she felt she was denied. Each restored book was a life lived by proxy, a testament to endurance in a world from which she felt utterly disconnected, a carefully preserved artifact in the crumbling museum of her own existence. If you want to know how this fragile world is about to be shattered by a man who buys and sells souls, watch until the end. I invite you to subscribe to the channel and comment on where you're watching from. We continue. Her life was a study in quiet restraint, a long, unbroken chain of duty that had begun in her late teens, nursing her mother through a slow, merciless illness. That period had hollowed her out, replacing youthful spontaneity with a hyper-awareness of fragility and loss. It was then that a wall had been built around her heart, not of stone, but of a delicate, impenetrable glass. Her virginity was a consequence of this isolation, an unplucked string on a forgotten instrument. It wasn't a moral stance or a conscious choice, but rather the quiet, unremarked-upon state of a woman who had never been truly seen, who had learned to fear the vulnerability that came with being touched, with being wanted. She was an expert in the art of preservation, and she had applied those skills all too well to herself. The Vance name, once a titan of Bostonian aristocracy, was now just another relic Elara was tasked with maintaining. Their family home was a mausoleum of past glories, where the air was heavy with the weight of expectation and the silent judgment of ancestral portraits. Her father, a man more comfortable with ledgers than with his own daughter, communicated through a language of disappointed sighs and pointed silences. He saw her not as a child to be cherished, but as the last viable asset in their portfolio, the final desperate gambit to save their legacy from the humiliation of ruin. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow that stretched across the threadbare Persian rugs, seemed to whisper of her obligation, reminding her that her life was not her own to live, but a debt to be paid to the ghosts of her lineage. This debt was to be settled through a marriage, an arrangement as cold and binding as the legal contracts her father pored over late into the night. Her fiancé, a young man from a similarly prestigious but equally fragile family, was a stranger with a practiced smile and empty eyes. Elara had accepted her fate with the same quiet resignation she applied to a hopelessly damaged text. You did what you could to salvage the whole, even if it meant sacrificing a part of the original beauty. She was the gilded collateral in a transaction designed to merge two dying empires, a dutiful sacrifice to preserve the illusion of grandeur. In this suffocating world of old money and older traditions, her untouched purity was her primary value, a cruel irony for a woman who felt more like a ghost than a bride-to-be. A profound and cavernous emptiness defined her days. She moved through her life with a delicate, practiced grace, a mask of serene competence that concealed the silent scream of her inner world. In the books she mended, she found worlds teeming with life, with heroines who raged against their fates, who loved with a fierce and reckless passion, and who were the authors of their own stories. She would trace the faded ink of a love letter penned centuries ago, the ghost of its passion, a stark, painful contrast to the sterile silence of her own heart. The disparity was a constant, low-grade torture, a reminder of a life she could only read about. She didn't yearn for a specific person or a place, but for the simple, terrifying possibility of feeling something real, something of her own. Sometimes she would stand at the grime-streaked window of her workshop, looking down at the vibrant pulse of the city below. The world outside was a kaleidoscope of motion and noise, cars gliding by, couples laughing as they shared a coffee, their casual intimacy a language she didn't understand. They were all moving forward, propelled by desires and ambitions she couldn't fathom, living their lives in the bright, unforgiving light of the present. She, meanwhile, remained suspended in the amber of the past, a silent observer behind the glass. The city was a living, breathing entity, and its vitality only served to amplify her own sense of stasis, of being a footnote in a story that was happening to everyone else but her. The end of her quiet solitude arrived in the form of a heavy, cream-colored envelope delivered by a courier. The invitation to the annual St. Jude's Foundation Gala was embossed with a gold crest, its calligraphy an elegant, looping script that felt more like a decree than a request. This was to be her final major social appearance before the wedding, her formal presentation as a bride-to-be. As she ran her finger over the sharp edge of the card, a chill, entirely separate from the autumn air, traced a path down her spine. It was a premonition, a subtle tremor in the foundations of her carefully constructed world. This piece of paper felt less like an invitation to a party and more like a summons to an execution, the beginning of a chapter she knew with a terrifying certainty she was not ready to read. The Vance residence on Beacon Hill was less a home and more a carefully curated museum of decline. Each morning, Ilara descended the grand curving staircase, her hand gliding over the polished mahogany banister, its surface cool and unyielding beneath her touch. The air was a stagnant blend of lemon oil, old paper, and the faint funereal scent of wilting hydrangeas her father insisted on keeping in the foyer. Sunlight, thin and pale, struggled to pierce the heavy velvet curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the oppressive silence. Ancestral portraits lined the walls, their painted eyes following her with an air of cold, patrician judgment. They were the ghosts of a legacy she was born to serve, a silent board of directors overseeing the slow, managed liquidation of their name. Her life was a performance for their benefit, a quiet pageant of duty staged in the chilly halls of a forgotten dynasty. Her father, Arthur Vance, was the chief warden of this gilded prison. A man constructed of straight lines and rigid principles, he inhabited his study like a monarch on a throne of ledgers and deeds. His interactions with Ilara were transactional, stripped of any paternal warmth. He would assess her appearance over the rim of his spectacles, his gaze lingering on her posture, her dress, the demure way she held her hands, as if inspecting a piece of porcelain before an important sale. He never spoke of love or happiness. He spoke of obligation, of legacy, of the Vance name, as if it were a fragile, sacred text that she, through her impending marriage, was tasked with restoring. His silence was a form of control, a vast, empty space she was terrified to disturb, for fear that the slightest emotional outburst would cause the entire fragile structure of their world to shatter around them. The instrument of this restoration was her fiancé, Edward Davies. He was the perfect embodiment of her fate, handsome in a bland, forgettable way, with a pedigree as old as her own and a fortune just as precarious. Their courtship was a series of carefully chaperoned meetings in sterile drawing rooms, where they exchanged pleasantries as rehearsed and empty as a playwright's stage directions. He would compliment her dress, she would inquire about his polo pony, and a chasm of unspoken truths would yawn between them. Ilara felt nothing in his presence, not dislike, not affection, only a profound and hollow resignation. He was not a person to her, but a symbol, the living embodiment of the loveless, passionless future that had been meticulously arranged to ensure the survival of two dying family trees. This arrangement was a constant low hum of dread beneath the surface of her quiet days. She felt like one of the rare books she so lovingly mended, an object of value, prized for its untouched condition and its lineage, about to be traded to a new collector to settle an old debt. The word love was never mentioned by anyone. The union was referred to in terms of alliance, of mutual benefit, of shoring up foundations. Her own feelings were an irrelevant footnote in the contract of her life. This sense of being a commodity, a beautiful, well-preserved asset, had seeped into her very bones. It reinforced the glass wall around her heart, convincing her that she was not a woman to be desired for herself, but a prize to be won, a legacy to be claimed. The preparations for the wedding were a slow, suffocating ritual of erasure. During a fitting for her wedding gown, she stood on a pedestal in a cloud of ivory silk and French lace, a team of seamstresses fluttering around her like moths. The dress was a masterpiece of historical design, beautiful and impossibly restrictive. As they laced the corset tighter, she felt her breath catch, the stays digging into her ribs like the bars of a cage. She stared at her reflection in the full-length mirror, a pale, serene stranger with haunted eyes. This was the woman her family needed her to be, flawless, silent, and bound. The weight of the fabric was immense, a physical manifestation of the crushing weight of expectation she carried every single moment of her life, a beautiful shroud for a soul already in mourning. Meetings with Edward's family were even more taxing. The Davies matriarch, a woman with diamonds as cold as her eyes, would survey Ilara with an appraising stare, her conversation revolving around bloodlines and the importance of maintaining appearances. They spoke of Ilara as if she weren't in the room, praising her quiet disposition and her impeccable Vance heritage as ideal qualities for a wife. They were not welcoming a new daughter, they were acquiring a subsidiary, a valuable brand to merge with their own. In their world, a person's worth was not measured by their character or their heart, but by the name they carried and the purity of their lineage. Ilara would sit through these teas, a porcelain cup trembling in her hand, feeling utterly and completely invisible, a ghost at her own feast. Her only escape was the workshop, that small, dusty room smelling of leather and glue. Here, surrounded by the silent, patient suffering of broken books, she could breathe. The meticulous work of mending a torn page or restitching a binding was a form of meditation, a way to impose order on a small corner of a chaotic world. It was the only place where her hands, not her name, defined her value. But even this sanctuary was not immune to the intrusion of her fate. A phone call from her father would shatter the peace, his clipped, impatient voice on the line reminding her of a dinner engagement or a social obligation. Each call was a summons, pulling her back from the one place she felt real into the suffocating performance of being Ilara Vance. One evening, as she passed her father's study, the door slightly ajar, she heard his voice, stripped of its usual careful modulation. He was on the phone, his words sharp and laced with a desperation she had never heard before. "The Davies merger is our only remaining option," he said, his voice low and guttural. "She is our final asset. The contract must be ironclad." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Merger, asset, contract. He was not just arranging her marriage, he was liquidating her. Any lingering, childish hope that he acted from a misguided sense of paternal protection dissolved in that moment, replaced by the cold, stark certainty that she was nothing more than the final, desperate move in a game she was not even allowed to play. The St. Jude's Foundation Gala was to be the final public step in this transaction. It was where her engagement to Edward would be celebrated, where the two families would present a united front of unassailable prosperity to the Boston elite. The dress was chosen for her, a column of deep emerald silk that her father deemed appropriately elegant. As she dressed for the evening, her movements were slow, robotic. Her father's words echoed in her mind: asset, contract. The emerald gown felt like a brand, marking her as property. He gave her a final inspection in the grand foyer, his only comment a curt nod and a reminder to remember her duty to the family. It was not a request, it was an order, a final tightening of the leash before she was paraded before the world. Standing before the mirror in her bedroom, the Vance diamonds cold against her throat, Elara saw the finished product of 22 years of careful preservation. She was the perfect daughter, the perfect fiancée, a flawless artifact ready for display. Her reflection was a mask of serene compliance, but behind her eyes a storm was gathering. A silent, desperate scream was building in her chest, a rebellion of the soul against a life that felt like a beautifully written death sentence. She was trapped, suffocating under the weight of a name she never asked for and a duty she could no longer bear. As the car waited outside to take her to the gala, she felt a terrifying premonition that the world she had so carefully held together was about to be irrevocably torn apart. The grand ballroom of the Copley Plaza was a glittering ocean of manufactured joy, a place where fortunes were paraded and alliances were forged over chilled champagne and polite, cutting remarks. Elara felt herself drowning in it. The light from a dozen crystal chandeliers fractured against diamonds and sequins, creating a blinding, restless glare. The air, thick with expensive perfume and the low thrum of a string quartet, felt heavy and suffocating in her lungs. She was a living exhibit, the Vance heir on display, her emerald gown a beacon of tradition, and her engagement to Edward a public declaration of her family's desperate bid for survival. Every smile was a performance, every nod a carefully rehearsed gesture. She was a perfect, silent doll in a jewel box, her inner world a stark, barren contrast to the opulent chaos surrounding her. Beside her, Edward Davies played his part with practiced ease, his hand resting possessively on the small of her back. His touch was light, yet it felt like a brand, a claim staked for all to see. He murmured pleasantries to passing acquaintances, his conversation a bland tapestry of polo scores and summering in the Hamptons. He was a handsome, empty vessel, the perfect consort for the artifact she was supposed to be. Elara offered a faint, automatic smile, her gaze drifting over the sea of faces, none of which held any real interest for her. She felt a profound and terrifying detachment, as if she were watching her own life from a great distance, a silent film where the heroine's screams were inaudible. The cage was beautiful, gilded and admired, but its bars were closing in, squeezing the very breath from her soul. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted. It was not a sudden change, but a slow, creeping chill that seemed to emanate from the grand archway. The confident hum of conversation faltered, replaced by a ripple of hushed, urgent whispers. Heads turned, eyes widened with a mixture of fear and a voracious curiosity. It was as if a predator had entered a field of grazing animals, its presence announced by a sudden, instinctual silence. Elara followed the collective gaze, and saw him. He stood alone, a figure of stark, minimalist elegance in a sea of old-world finery. He wore a flawlessly tailored black suit, no tie, the top button of his white shirt undone. He was an island of stillness in the churning social tide, a disruption of the natural order. His name was a murmur that passed through the crowd like a contagion: Damian Blackwood. He was a man forged from shadows and steel, a stark contrast to the soft, pedigreed men who populated her world. His features were sharp, carved from granite, with a severity that was both intimidating and magnetic. Dark hair was cut short, ruthlessly neat, and his eyes, even from across the room, she could feel their intensity, were a deep, impenetrable black. He was not a product of this world. He was its conqueror. He scanned the room with a look of bored appraisal, his gaze dismissing the titans of industry and the doyens of society as if they were insignificant pieces on a chessboard he had already won. His power was not in his name or his lineage, but in the cold, unassailable confidence of a man who had built his empire on the ruins of others. A man who feared nothing because he had nothing left to lose. And then those predatory eyes found hers. The vast, glittering ballroom seemed to dissolve, the noise fading to a distant hum. For a breathless, terrifying moment, there was only the unbroken line of his gaze locking with hers. It was a look of such piercing intensity that she felt stripped bare, as if he could see past the emerald silk and the Vance diamonds, past the carefully constructed facade of the dutiful daughter, and into the secret, untouched core of her. No one had ever looked at her like that before. She was not an asset, not a name, not a bride-to-be. In his eyes, she was something else entirely. A puzzle to be solved, a fortress to be breached. A strange, unfamiliar heat bloomed in her chest, a terrifying fusion of fear and a wild, forbidden curiosity. He began to move. His stride was deliberate, unhurried, yet it carried an undeniable sense of purpose. The crowd parted before him, a subconscious act of deference to a power they recognized and feared. He cut a direct path through the glittering throng, his focus singular, his destination clear. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in the cage of her corset. Edward, oblivious, was still talking to a portly banker, but Ilara could not hear him. Her entire being was attuned to the approaching man, to the silent, dangerous energy that rolled off him in waves. She felt an instinct to flee, to retreat into the shadows where she belonged. But she was rooted to the spot, pinned by the sheer force of his will. A moth drawn to a flame that promised certain incineration. He stopped directly in front of them, his presence so commanding it seemed to suck the very air from around her. He was taller than she had realized, a formidable shadow that eclipsed the glittering lights of the ballroom. His gaze remained fixed on her, pointedly ignoring Edward's outstretched hand and stammered greeting. "Mr. Davies," Damian Blackwood said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through Ilara's bones. The acknowledgment was a dismissal, a formality dispensed with before turning to the real object of his attention. He looked at Ilara, a faint, unreadable smile playing on his lips. "Ilara Vance," he stated, not as a question, but as a confirmation. "The restorer of lost things, a noble profession, trying to save the past from its inevitable decay." His words were a quiet indictment, a subtle mockery of her life's work and the world she represented. Edward bristled, but Damian's focus was absolute. He held Ilara's gaze, and she saw a flicker of something in the depths of his dark eyes, a profound, ancient pain that mirrored the loneliness in her own soul. It was a fleeting, shocking moment of recognition, a silent acknowledgment of a shared wound. But some things, he continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a conspiratorial murmur meant only for her, are not meant to be saved. They are meant to be broken so something new can be built from the pieces. The statement hung in the air between them, a challenge and a prophecy, a terrifying promise of annihilation and creation. As he spoke, he reached out, his fingers lightly brushing against the back of her gloved hand where it rested on Edward's arm. The touch was brief, almost accidental, but it sent a jolt of pure electricity through her. Through the fine silk of her glove, she felt the searing heat of his skin, a stark, living warmth that contrasted with the cold, sterile world she inhabited. It was a touch that felt less like a polite gesture and more like an act of possession, a branding. Her breath hitched, and for a dizzying second the world tilted on its axis. The contact was a violation of every rule she had ever lived by, and yet it was the most real thing she had ever felt in her entire life. Without another word, he gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod and moved on, melting back into the crowd as seamlessly as he had appeared. He left a vortex of silence in his wake. Edward was sputtering with indignation. Her father was watching from across the room with a thunderous expression. But Ilara was numb. She could still feel the phantom heat of his touch on her hand, a burning imprint on her very soul. The encounter had lasted less than a minute, but it had irrevocably shattered the fragile glass of her composure. Damien Blackwood had not just seen her. He had issued a silent declaration. He had planted a seed of chaos in the meticulously ordered garden of her life, and she knew, with a terrifying and exhilarating certainty, that it was already beginning to take root. The ghost of Damien Blackwood's touch lingered on Ilara's skin long after the gala ended, a phantom heat that refused to fade. Throughout the silent, sterile car ride home, she could still feel the brief, searing pressure of his fingers against her glove, a point of contact that had somehow rewired her entire nervous system. The world outside the polished windows of the Bentley seemed muted, the vibrant city lights bleeding into a watercolor blur. Beside her, Edward prattled on about a polo match, his voice a meaningless drone that failed to penetrate the roaring silence in her mind. Her father sat opposite them, his face a mask of cold fury, his disapproval a palpable force in the confined space. She knew his anger was not for the transgression against her, but for the public disruption of a carefully managed transaction. She was a flawed asset, and her value had just been publicly questioned by the most powerful man in the room. Back in the oppressive quiet of her bedroom, the emerald silk gown felt like a stranger's skin. She peeled it off with trembling fingers, the fabric hissing as it slid to the floor, a discarded snakeskin from a life she no longer recognized. Staring at her reflection in the antique silver-backed mirror, she no longer saw the demure, compliant daughter. She saw the woman Damien Blackwood had looked at, an object of intense predatory focus. His gaze had not been one of admiration, but of assessment, of ownership. It was a terrifying thought, yet it ignited a spark deep within her, a feeling so foreign and potent it stole her breath. For the first time in her life, she had been truly seen, and the experience had left a permanent fracture in the flawless porcelain of her composure, a crack through which a dangerous light was beginning to seep. The following days were a study in heightened tension.
Elara moved through her routine at the workshop with a feverish, distracted energy, her hands mending paper, while her mind endlessly replayed the encounter. Every unexpected sound made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat as she anticipated his reappearance. He had become an unseen presence in her life, a shadow stretching from the glittering world of finance into the dusty, quiet corners of her own. The fear he inspired was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her thoughts, but it was intertwined with a thread of something else, something she dared not name, a wild, thrilling anticipation. He was a storm on the horizon, and while every instinct screamed for her to seek shelter, a reckless part of her soul yearned to stand in the open and feel the rain. A week later, the first tangible sign of his continued interest arrived. A courier delivered a flat rectangular package to her workshop, wrapped in simple brown paper with no return address. Her name was written on the label in a severe, blocky script. Her hands shook as she sliced through the tape. Inside, nestled in black tissue paper, was a book. It was a first-edition copy of Petrarch's sonnets, its leather binding worn to a soft, supple texture, the kind of beautiful, authentic decay she revered. There was no note, no card, only the silent, powerful statement of the object itself. He had not sent flowers or jewels, the common currency of men like Edward. He had sent her a piece of a soul, a volume of passionate, unrequited love, a gesture so intimate and insightful it felt like a violation, a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. The book was both a gift and a threat, a gilded chess piece placed deliberately in the center of her small, ordered world. She ran her fingers over the embossed title, the raised leather a tactile echo of his touch. This was not a random act of courtship. It was a demonstration of his power, of his reach. He had taken the time to understand her, to learn the language of her quiet passions, and was now using it against her. The gesture was meant to disarm her, to show her that he saw beyond the Vance name and the impending marriage. He saw her, the restorer of lost things, and he was laying siege to the very fortress of her identity. A part of her was terrified by this invasion, but another, deeper part, felt a dizzying, traitorous thrill at being so thoroughly understood by this dangerous, enigmatic man. Driven by a desperate need to understand the predator who was circling her, Elara spent hours that night scouring the internet for information on Damian Blackwood. The man who emerged from the cold, hard text of financial articles was a creature of mythic ruthlessness. He was a corporate vulture, a specialist in hostile takeovers, known for buying legacy companies like the ones her own family had built their name on, and dismantling them for profit, selling them off piece by piece without a shred of sentiment. He was a self-made phantom who had clawed his way out of a violent, impoverished past, and his vengeance against the old money establishment was legendary. The stark, brutal reality of his public persona was a chilling contradiction to the man who had sent a volume of centuries-old love poetry. He was a destroyer of beautiful old things, yet he had just given her one. The psychological warfare escalated.
A few days later, she learned that an antique set of bookbinding tools she had been trying to acquire for years, tools being sold by a small European auction house, had been bought by an anonymous bidder for a price far exceeding their value. The next morning, they were delivered to her workshop. Again, there was no note. The message was implicit, delivered with the cold, silent precision of a sniper's bullet. I can give you anything you desire. I know what you want before you do. Each gesture was a silken thread in a web he was weaving around her, isolating her, making her world contingent on his will. He was demonstrating that the quiet, independent life she had carved out for herself was an illusion he could shatter at any moment. This constant invisible pressure began to erode her defenses. The impending marriage to Edward, once a source of quiet resignation, now felt like a suffocating death sentence. Edward's polite, vapid conversations, his complete lack of interest in her work or her inner world, stood in stark, painful contrast to Damien's unnerving, laser-like focus. She found herself comparing the two men, a dangerous and disloyal exercise that filled her with guilt. Edward offered safety, a continuation of the life she had always known, a comfortable, gilded cage. Damien offered what? Oblivion? A thrilling, terrifying form of destruction? He was the embodiment of everything she had been taught to fear, yet he was the only person who had ever made her feel as though the contents of her soul were worth examining. One rainy afternoon, the small brass bell above her workshop door chimed, announcing a visitor. She looked up from a crumbling manuscript, her heart seizing in her chest. It was him. Damien Blackwood stood in the doorway, a tall, dark figure silhouetted against the gray light, the scent of rain and expensive vetiver cutting through the familiar aroma of old paper and glue. He wore a black cashmere coat, the fabric seeming to absorb the light in the small, cluttered room. His presence was overwhelming, a stark slash of modern, ruthless power in her sanctuary of antiquity. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden, profound silence. He had breached her final line of defense, bringing the battle directly into her territory. His eyes, dark and unreadable, scanned the workshop, taking in the stacks of books, the pots of glue, the presses and tools of her trade. His gaze was not dismissive, but analytical, as if he were cataloging every detail, committing it to memory. A quiet place, he observed, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. A place to hide from the world. Ilara's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but she refused to let it show. She rose slowly from her stool, placing a protective hand on the manuscript she was working on. "It's a place of preservation," she corrected him, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I am not hiding. What do you want, Mr. Blackwood?" The question hung in the air, a direct challenge he seemed both surprised and intrigued by. He moved closer, his polished Italian shoes silent on the worn wooden floor. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, his gaze fell to the delicate, illuminated manuscript beneath her hand. "A 15th-century book of hours," he said, his knowledge startling her. He reached out, his long fingers moving toward the brittle vellum page. It was a purely instinctual protective reaction. Ilara moved without thinking, her hand covering his to stop him. "Don't," she breathed, "it will crumble." The contact was electric, 1,000 times more potent than the fleeting touch at the gala. His skin was warm and firm beneath her palm, a shocking, living reality. The world narrowed to that single point of contact, the air crackling with a tension so thick she could taste it on her tongue. They froze, their hands clasped over the ancient prayer book, a tableau of modern power and historical fragility. For a long, breathless moment, neither of them moved. He did not pull away. Instead, his dark eyes lifted from the book to meet hers, and the cold, controlled mask slipped for an instant. She saw a flicker of something raw and unguarded in their depths, not just desire, but a profound, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. It was a shocking moment of recognition, a silent acknowledgement that they were both damaged, both restorers of their own broken pieces. He had expected her to flinch, to recoil in fear. He had not expected her to meet his advance with a strength of her own, a fierce, protective fire that he found himself inexplicably drawn to. Slowly, deliberately, he withdrew his hand from under hers. The loss of contact left her skin feeling cold, exposed. His composure settled back into place, but the air between them had been irrevocably altered. He looked around her workshop again, this time with a different expression. It was no longer the appraisal of a predator examining its prey's den, but something more complex, something tinged with a strange, almost wistful curiosity.
Fragility, he said, his voice low and laced with a new, ambiguous meaning, is often a dangerous illusion. He held her gaze for one final intense moment before turning and leaving as silently as he arrived, the chime of the bell marking his exit like the tolling for a soul already lost.
Ilara sank onto her stool, her body trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The workshop, her sanctuary, no longer felt safe. It felt charged, haunted by his presence, the very air thick with the memory of his scent and the phantom heat of his touch. She stared at her own hand, the one that had dared to touch him, half expecting it to be scorched. The encounter had shattered something within her, breaking down the carefully constructed walls between duty and desire, between fear and fascination. He was not just a man, he was a catalyst, a force of nature that threatened to tear her predictable, passionless world apart at the seams. And she was no longer certain she wanted to stop him. That evening, she was forced to attend a small dinner party with Edward and his parents. The conversation was a sterile ballet of pleasantries about finances, summer homes, and the upcoming wedding. Edward, oblivious to her inner turmoil, placed his cool, dry hand over hers on the white linen tablecloth. The gesture, meant to be possessive and affectionate, felt like the touch of a ghost. It had no heat, no life, no electricity. All she could feel was the memory of Damien's hand beneath hers, the living warmth that had promised both ruin and a terrifying, exhilarating awakening. The contrast was a physical pain, a stark clarification of her dilemma. She was standing at a precipice, forced to choose between a slow, comfortable death in a gilded cage and a fall into a dark, passionate unknown. Lying awake in her canopy bed that night, surrounded by the ancestral ghosts of the Vance family, Ilara finally allowed herself to acknowledge the terrifying truth. She was not just afraid of Damien Blackwood, she was drawn to him. She replayed the moment in the workshop, the feel of his skin, the unguarded look in his eyes, and for the first time in her 22 years, she felt the stirrings of a raw, physical desire. It was a shocking, shameful admission, a betrayal of her family, of Edward, of the very principles of her carefully preserved life. The guilt was a heavy weight in her chest, but beneath it a new, powerful current was flowing, a yearning to feel something real, even if it was dangerous, even if it destroyed her. She finally understood that the choice was no longer about saving her family's name or fulfilling her duty. The choice was about saving herself. Her life up to this point had been an exercise in preservation, in maintaining the beautiful, hollow shell of the past. But Damien Blackwood was not the past. He was a brutal, undeniable force of the present. He represented a world of chaos, power, and raw, unfiltered emotion that she had only ever read about in her books. He was a threat not just to her future, but to the very foundation of the woman she had always been. And a secret, treacherous part of her soul whispered that it was a foundation she was suddenly, desperately willing to see crumble into dust. The silence in Damien Blackwood's penthouse was a physical entity, a vast, cold expanse that mirrored the city lights glittering like shattered diamonds below. For days since her return, Ilara had moved through its sterile perfection like a ghost, her presence barely registering against the polished chrome and stark white walls. The unspoken tension between them was a taut wire, humming with a frequency only she could feel. Tonight, the humming had become a scream. She stood before the panoramic window, her reflection a pale, waifish specter against the abyss of the night sky, and made a decision. She would no longer be a passive artifact in his collection. She would stop waiting for him to act and would, for the first time in her life, initiate the narrative. This quiet, internal vow was her first true act of rebellion,
a transgression not against him, but against the silent, duteous woman she had always been forced to be. She began to walk, her bare feet silent on the cold Italian marble, a deliberate pilgrimage from the guest suite to the heart of his domain, his private study. The long hallway was a gallery of modern brutalist art, each piece a testament to a world devoid of sentiment, a world she did not understand. Yet with each step she felt the layers of Ilara Vance, the duteous daughter and preserved relic, peeling away. The fear was still there, a cold stone in the pit of her stomach, but it was now accompanied by a strange, exhilarating calm. She was no longer just a mender of broken books. She was an explorer venturing into the unmapped territory of a broken man. This journey across the cold floor was a crossing of a far more significant threshold, a conscious step out of the past and into a terrifying, uncertain present she had chosen for herself. He was exactly where she knew he would be, a dark silhouette against the city's electric glow, his back to the room. He held a glass of amber liquid, but he wasn't drinking, merely staring out at the kingdom he had built on the ashes of others. He did not turn as the door whispered open, but the stillness in his powerful shoulders tightened. "I assumed you would remain in the library," he stated, his voice a low, resonant baritone that vibrated through the floor. The words were a casual cruelty, a test of her resolve. She paused in the doorway, allowing the silence to stretch, refusing to be baited. In his world, silence was a weapon, a void used to intimidate and control.
By holding it, by refusing to fill it with a nervous reply, she was claiming a small piece of that power for herself. "I am not one of your relics, Damien." The sound of his first name, spoken aloud by her for the first time, was a stone thrown into the still, deep waters of the room. It was an act of profound intimacy and defiance, a claim of equality she had no right to make. He turned then, slowly, his movements fluid and predatory. In the dim light from the city below, his face was a mask of shadows and sharp angles, his expression unreadable. "You are not an object to be acquired and then forgotten on a shelf," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she took a deliberate step into the room, then another, closing the vast, intimidating space between them. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her gaze did not waver. She was no longer asking for his attention, she was commanding it. She stopped just beyond arm's reach, the air between them crackling with an almost visible energy. "You made a deal for a name and a body. You purchased collateral," she stated, her voice quiet but ringing with a newfound clarity that surprised them both. "But you did not purchase me. The woman who lives inside, the one who thinks and feels, she is not for sale." She held his gaze, a terrifying act of will. "So if you want to understand the asset you've acquired, you will have to do more than simply own it. And if I am to survive in this gilded cage, I need to understand the man who built it." It was not a plea for freedom or a cry for mercy. It was an ultimatum, a proposal for a new, far more dangerous contract between them. A long, fraught silence descended, so absolute that Ilara could hear the frantic beat of her own heart. He studied her, his dark eyes narrowed, the cold, calculating mask of the billionaire warring with something deeper, something raw and unguarded. He saw not the terrified virgin he had taken from the gala, but a woman forged in the quiet fire of her own desolation, a woman who was meeting his power not with fear, but with a challenge. "Understanding me is a dangerous proposition, Ilara," he finally said, his voice rough, laced with an emotion that sounded almost like a warning to himself. "There is nothing inside of me worth restoring, only ruins."
It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her, a confession of his own profound damage, a crack in the impenetrable fortress of his soul. His admission did not frighten her, it galvanized her. The restorer in her, the part of her that instinctively sought to mend the broken and preserve the beautiful, recognized the profound wound he was revealing. This was the true, hidden text of Damian Blackwood. She closed the final few inches between them, her resolve solidifying into a singular purpose. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she reached up and laid her palm flat against the hard wall of his chest. The fine cashmere of his sweater was soft, but beneath it she felt the powerful, steady thrum of his heart, a living, vital rhythm in the center of his sterile world. "Then let me see the ruins," she whispered, the words both a plea and a vow. It was an act of total surrender, not to his control, but to his brokenness, a willing descent into his darkness. Her touch was the catalyst that shattered his formidable control. A violent shudder racked his body, a tremor that began in his soul and radiated outward. His hand came up to cover hers, his fingers lacing through her own, pressing her palm harder against his chest, as if to absorb her warmth, her life. His other hand moved to the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft strands of her hair as he drew her inexorably closer. He lowered his head, and his mouth captured hers in a kiss that was not tender or gentle, but a raw, desperate collision of two starving souls. It was a kiss of brutal possession and aching vulnerability, a torrent of unspoken pain, anger, and a loneliness so profound it stole her breath away. It tasted of expensive whiskey, of regret, and of a devastating, hopeless need. When the kiss finally broke, they were both gasping for air, their foreheads pressed together in the shared darkness. The city lights cast long, dancing shadows across the room, illuminating the wreckage of their composure. Ilara looked up into his eyes and saw that the cold, impenetrable shields were gone. In their place was a vast, dark expanse of pain, a raw vulnerability that was more intimidating than his power had ever been. He said nothing, his ragged breaths the only sound in the room. He didn't need to speak. In that single, shattering moment, the terms of their arrangement had been irrevocably rewritten. The debt was gone, the contract voided, replaced by a bond forged not in finance, but in a shared, terrifying intimacy. She had asked to see the ruins, and he had shown her the truth of his devastation. He pulled back slowly, his hands moving to frame her face, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones, as his gaze searched hers, looking for the fear he was so certain he would find there. But she met his intense, questioning look with a quiet, trembling resolve. This was it. This was the true transgression, the irrevocable act. It was not the surrendering of her body, but the baring of her soul to his. In that moment, her carefully guarded virginity, the quality that had defined her worth in the old world, seemed like a meaningless, childish concept.
What she had just offered him was infinitely more precious. He took her hand, his grip firm and possessive, but no longer cold, and led her from the study. As the door closed behind them, she knew the quiet, preserved life of Ilara Vance was over, its final chapter written, its cover closed for good. The first light of dawn was a sterile gray blade, slicing through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Damian's bedroom and illuminating the profound emptiness where he should have been. Ilara awoke to a chilling silence, the vast Arctic expanse of the bed a stark testament to her solitude. The only evidence that the previous night had been real was the faint masculine scent of his skin on the pillow next to her and the chaotic tangle of the 1,000-thread-count sheets. She felt a deep, seismic dislocation, as if the woman who had made that fateful journey to his study had been a different person entirely. The act of surrender, which had felt like a claiming of some unknown power, now seemed like a catastrophic misjudgment, a leap into a void that had simply swallowed her whole. She was an echo in a room that had already forgotten the sound it once made. He had retreated behind walls far more formidable than those of his penthouse. She found him hours later in his study, the heart of his empire, already encased in the flawless armor of a dark, bespoke suit. He stood before a bank of glowing screens, a general surveying his battlefield. The vulnerability he had shown her erased as if it were a line of bad code. He didn't turn as she entered, his focus absolute. "A car is at your disposal," he said, his voice clipped and devoid of any warmth, the sound of transactions and dismissals. "A personal shopper will be here at noon." The intimacy they had shared was not just ignored, it was being actively buried under a mountain of luxurious, impersonal arrangements. His withdrawal was a brutal and efficient cauterization of a wound he refused to acknowledge, and she was the collateral damage of his self-preservation. Left to wander the silent, museum-like apartment, Ilara was consumed by waves of suffocating guilt. It wasn't the shame of a virgin giving herself to a man who had bought her, but the far more painful shame of a fool. She had seen the profound loneliness in him, the shared damage, and had naively believed that their collision could create something other than wreckage. She had offered him the most fragile, untouched part of herself, not her body, but her hope, and he had treated it with the same cold indifference he applied to a corporate acquisition. The penthouse, with its priceless art and panoramic views, felt like the most opulent prison in the world, its beauty a constant, mocking reminder of the ugly, hollow space that had opened up inside her chest. The transgression had not freed her, it had simply shown her the true dimensions of her cage. In a moment of desperate, primal need for an anchor, she called her father. The hope for some lingering thread of paternal connection was a fragile, stupid thing, and it was severed with surgical precision. Arthur Vance's voice was as cold and brittle as ancient parchment. He already knew. The tone was not of a father speaking to a shamed daughter, but of a businessman confirming the final clause of a contract. "You made your bed with that man, Ilara," he stated, the words stripped of all emotion. "The Vance name is secure. Your part in that is now concluded. Do not call this house again." The click of the phone disconnecting was the sound of a door being bolted forever. She was no longer a daughter, no longer a Vance. She was an externality, a cost written off the books, utterly and completely alone. She became a student of his suffering, observing him from the periphery of his world. She saw the way he held himself in the deep hours of the night, a solitary king in his glass tower, staring down at the sprawling city lights as if they were enemy encampments. The whiskey glass in his hand was a constant companion, his grip so tight she was certain it would shatter. He was punishing himself, she realized, for that single catastrophic breach of his own defenses. Allowing her to witness the ruins of his soul had been a violation of his most fundamental rule: never show weakness. His coldness was not directed solely at her. It was a scorched earth policy against his own moment of humanity. His pain was a mirror to her own, a silent, agonizing conversation happening across an unbridgeable divide. The woman she had been was gone, lost somewhere in the sterile sheets of Damien's bed. The dutiful daughter, the quiet book restorer, the sacrificial fiancé, all were ghosts of a life that no longer existed. But nothing had risen from the ashes. She was adrift in a terrifying limbo, defined only by the man who now refuses to even look at her. She wore clothes he had bought, ate food he had provided, and lived in the gilded cage he had constructed. Yet she felt more invisible than ever. Her past had been erased by her father's decree, and her present was a silent, empty waiting room. This profound loss of self was the true divesting consequence of her choice, a freedom so absolute and untethered that it felt indistinguishable from annihilation. She had traded one form of preservation for another, becoming a living artifact in his collection of broken things. Amid the desolation, a flicker of the old Ilara surfaced. In the corner of Damien's vast, impersonal library, she found a 17th-century botanical atlas, its leather spine split, and a section of its hand-painted plates suffering from water damage. An old, familiar instinct took over. With hands that felt like her own for the first time in days, she carried the heavy volume to a large desk. The methodical, sacred process of examining the damage, of tracing the faded pigments, and feeling the brittle texture of the paper was like a prayer. It was a connection to a part of herself that existed independently of any man's name or any financial contract. This was her skill, her knowledge, her purpose. In the quiet act of planning a restoration, she began to mend a small piece of herself, rediscovering a strength that was not given, but earned. This fragile new core of resolve propelled her back to his study that evening. She found him in the same position as before, a sentinel bathed in the cold blue light of his monitors. She did not wait for his dismissal. She walked into the center of the room, forcing him to acknowledge her presence. Was it a mistake? Her voice was steady, cutting through the electronic hum. The other night, was that the mistake? It was not an accusation or a plea, but a demand for truth. She was refusing to let their shared moment be relegated to the status of a shameful secret. She was forcing him to look at the wreckage he had tried to sweep under the rug, to name the ghost that now haunted the space between them. She would not be erased by his silence. She would give it a name and make him speak it. Her directness shattered his composure. He turned from the screens, his body rigid, and for a terrifying, beautiful second, she saw the unguarded, wounded man from that night flicker in his eyes. His jaw clenched, a muscle twitching in a desperate fight for control. "The only mistake," he bit out, his voice a low, gravelly sound of suppressed agony, "was thinking I could possess something so delicate without completely destroying it." The confession was a raw, bleeding thing. He shoved himself away from the desk, pacing like a caged animal. "You should have stayed in your dusty workshop, Ilara. This world will break you." He strode past her, his proximity a wave of cold fury, and left the room, his words a final, desperate attempt to drive her away for her own good. His warning, however, landed not on the fragile girl he thought he was protecting, but on the woman who was beginning to emerge from the ruins. He saw her as breakable, a delicate artifact, but he was wrong. She had weathered the absolute betrayal of her family, the complete annihilation of her identity, and the brutal, cold shoulder of his regret. She was still here. His fear was not for her, she realized with sudden, stunning clarity. It was for himself. He was terrified of the destruction he carried within him. A quiet, unshakable resolve settled deep in her bones. She would not run. She would not allow him to exile her to save himself. She had been brought to this kingdom of shadows as a piece of collateral, but she would not remain a prisoner. The silent war was over, and a new, far more dangerous one was about to begin. Ilara found her new beginning in the slow, meticulous resurrection of the past. Days after their last volatile encounter, the vast library had become her kingdom, the large mahogany desk her throne. Damien was a phantom, his presence felt only in the hushed efficiency of the household staff and the lingering scent of his cologne in the hallways at night. But his absence no longer felt like a punishment. It was a space for her to breathe, to expand. With a surgeon's precision, she worked on the damaged atlas, each carefully repaired page a stitch in the fabric of her own unraveling soul. She was not a prisoner waiting for her captor's return.
She was an artisan, a creator, reclaiming her identity not by escaping his world, but by imposing her own quiet, enduring order upon a small corner of it. This was not submission. It was a silent, powerful occupation. He found her there late one evening, a solitary figure, illuminated by the warm glow of a single desk lamp. The rest of the library was cast in deep velvety shadows, making her appear like a master painter's subject in a forgotten masterpiece. Ilara felt the shift in the atmosphere before she heard a sound. A subtle cooling of the air, a sudden weight that settled in the profound silence. She didn't look up, her hands remaining steady as she applied a thin layer of archival paste to a torn leaf. He stood in the archway, a motionless silhouette against the distant city lights, simply watching her. It was not the predatory gaze of an owner assessing his property, but something else entirely. The quiet, unnerved stare of a man witnessing a ritual he did not understand, but was inexplicably drawn to. The air hummed with a tension that was no longer born of fear, but of a fragile, burgeoning curiosity. For what felt like an eternity, the only sounds were the soft rustle of ancient paper and the distant, muted heartbeat of the city. Ilara continued her work, her focus a shield and a statement. She was not performing for him. She was existing, powerfully and completely, within her own element. Her world of patience, of healing, of reverence for what endures, was a stark contrast to his universe of swift, brutal transactions and disposability.
The mingling scents of her rice paste and the expensive vetiver he wore created a strange, anachronistic perfume in the air, a fusion of their two opposing realities. Finally, he moved, his steps so quiet on the thick Persian rug she almost didn't register them. He did not approach her directly, but instead went to a dark, unadorned shelf in the farthest corner of the room, a place she had never seen him go before. When he returned to her circle of light, he placed the small, unassuming object on the edge of her desk next to her neatly arranged restoration tools. It was a simple leather-bound journal, its cover scuffed and its corners softened with age, bearing no title or markings. It was utterly plain, yet it pulsed with a significance that made the priceless first editions surrounding them feel like meaningless trinkets. He offered no explanation, his face a mask of profound stoic effort. But Ilara understood. This was not a book he had acquired, it was a book he had lived. He was giving her the key to his fortress, the original manuscript of his pain, written in a child's unsteady hand. It was an act of terrifying vulnerability, a confession whispered in the language she understood best. The silent, sacred offering of a story that had never before been read by another soul. She finally lifted her gaze from her work, looking not at the journal, but directly into his eyes. The predator was gone. The ruthless billionaire had vanished. In their place was a man stripped bare of all his defenses, his dark eyes holding the haunted, pleading look of a lost boy who had just handed over his only map home. The power dynamic between them had not just shifted. It had inverted, shattered, and been reborn as something else entirely. It was no longer about ownership or survival, but about trust. With a reverence she had previously reserved for the most fragile of manuscripts, she slowly wiped her hands on a clean cloth and reached out. Her fingers did not tremble as she laid her palm flat on the worn leather cover of the journal. It was an acceptance, a silent vow to protect this history, to restore this soul. A shudder of relief, so faint it was almost imperceptible, passed through him. He gave a single curt nod, a gesture that contained a universe of gratitude and fear, before turning and walking away, leaving her alone with the most valuable thing he would ever own. The door to the library clicked shut, the sound not an ending, but a beginning. Ilara looked down at the simple book, the story of the man hidden within the monster, and felt the weight of a future she could not have imagined. She was no longer a restorer of lost things, but a keeper of found souls. The path ahead was an unwritten page, but for the first time she was not afraid of what would be written there. If their journey from ruin to restoration has moved you, I invite you to subscribe, like, and share this story, and let us know in the comments what you believe the future holds for them.